Cascading Style Sheets has been an important part of my life since I first proposed it in 1994. Now, I need to know a little bit about you. How many of you know CSS? Would you recognize the term when you see it? Yeah, most of you. Very good, all of you. Very good, excellent. You're a smart student. I'm going to tell you a little bit how this all got started. I was a little bit older than many of you when I proposed it, but not so much. And it's come to grown to be something that you will need to know if you're going to do anything in web design. And web design is, you know, what a lot of people make their living from. And I hope to be able to inspire you to write your CSS code better and to use it in a way that perhaps you hadn't thought about it before. So my story starts here. This is a picture from the CERN physics laboratory. It's in Geneva, in Switzerland, on the border between France and Switzerland, actually. And it was set up to do physics stuff, to detect small particle. It wasn't set up to do computer science, but they needed a lot of computers in order to analyze the data coming out of this machine. This is the world's biggest machine. And you can see the scale of it by looking at this man here at the bottom. And this is built underground. It's an incredible thing where they smash small particle together in this room, and they see what comes out of that collision. But to analyze all this, they needed a lot of computers, and they needed computer scientists to write the software for doing the analyzation. And this is a picture of Tim Berners-Lee, who invented most of the web as we know it today. He invented 3 crucial concepts that I think all of us use every day in our lives. One is the concept of the URLs, you know, the http:// thing, or the www://. You know, I'm going to give you a quick lesson here how to pronounce www, you know? How do you say it? In Polish, I'm sure it's something else. In English, you can say www. In Norwegian, you can say www. But that's all wrong. How to pronounce www is like a car that doesn't start. Okay? Now that you know it, you'll never forget it. It's a car that doesn't start. But the web actually started, and it runs just fine. And Tim, he invented URLs. He invented the HTML language. We don't write HTML every day, all of us, I think, maybe. But we use web pages that use HTML. And he invented the HTTP protocol, which transfers these pages magically from one computer to the other. So when I arrived there in 1994, a couple of years after he did the major invention, so to say, there were still a few parts missing, though. And CSS was one of them. And I'll say more about that. Just show you a few more pictures from the CERN environment. This is the first public web terminal that was set up. It's a Sun Microsystems workstation. It was set up in the corner here where a lot of people, including Tim and I, had to walk by every day on our way to the office. And this is the, I don't really know, I'm not a physicist, I don't really know what goes through these pipes here. But I have an idea. I have an hypothesis that as Tim was walking past this on his way to the office every day, he sort of got the inspiration for the HTML tags from this. You know, in HTML, you have the H1, H2, H3, right? And then you get the jokes. You get the jokes. That's good. You laugh in the right places. Excellent. OK, so here's the board that was set up here by the computer. There was a little sort of info thing showing, you know, what is this project here about? I'm sure you do these kind of things for your projects, too. And here was kind of the slogan, the marketing campaign. World Wide Web, you click, we do the rest. Yeah? You like the slogan? Yes. Yeah, maybe it's a good, yeah. It worked. I mean, the web took off. But I don't think it was only because of the marketing campaign. It took off, I think, mostly because the technical, the quality of the specifications were very good. And also the fact that the web was open specification. The fact that Tim didn't try to make money from it, CERN didn't try to make money from it. It was published openly for everyone to use without paying any fees or anything. That was very, very important. So this is what the world the World Wide Web looked like around 1994. We had some browsers, including this. This is the NCSA browser. Anyone use the Mosaic browser? No? No? One person? Was one person there? Yeah. It was very popular around 1994. And it was incredible. I mean, this was how people came to the web for the first time. They saw pages like this. And, you know, it's incredible. The blue lines here, of course, indicates this is a link. You can click on it. And if you clicked on it, magic happened. You were suddenly transformed to a different place. Another document came to you. And this was totally new in the 1990s. Of course, kids today grow up with this, so it's not so magical, perhaps. But at the time, it was revolutionary. So people, you know, it opened their eyes, and they started to come to the web, not just the scientists of CERN, but also the people, the authors, the artists, everyone who wanted to share information with others came to this web because it was so easy to use and was so compelling. Compelling, they started to complain, you see? They started to ask, one of the first questions they started to ask was, how do I set the font size? How do I set the colors? Because at that point in time, all the web pages had a gray background and black text and blue links. That was hard-coded in the browser. You could make a new browser and have different colors, but it was hard-coded. You couldn't change it. There was no way for the author to change that. And some said, well, that's good. I don't really want to know what colors the authors want to use. I want to use my colors. And others said, well, you know, maybe there's this thing about design, and maybe designers, we should allow them to express themselves a little. And the designers basically said, okay, well, if you don't give me the tools I need, then I'm going to go out there and make my own tools, and I'm going to send everything across as images. Let's look at how that could have worked. First, though, we need to see a little bit on the HTML language itself. Here's a very simple HTML document. It's one HTML tag called h1. h1 is for heading. You know that. You know CSS. You know a little bit of HTML too, I'm sure. And if you don't, I can explain it to you in 60 seconds. It's that simple. The heading starts over on the left, and then it ends over on the right. And the slash there indicates that this is an ending. And what's in between here, headline, that is really, you know, the content of the element. And now we know that this is a headline. But we know it from the tags and not from what's written here. It could have been anything in between here. But it's very important that it's simple language, simple to write tags. It's important that we know that there's universal semantics. We know that H1 means heading. That's not a lot of semantics. So, you know, semantics means the meaning of things, the role of things. It's important for search engines, though, when they're going to analyze this page, to know that, okay, this is a headline, so it's probably a little more important than the other content in there. It's also important to see that HTML doesn't say anything about the presentation of the language. It doesn't say anything about colors. And the designer, Tim, he didn't want there to be anything about colors in there. And that means you can present this element both on a screen, which has colors. All the screens have colors now. It wasn't like that in 1994, but today all screens have colors. But printers maybe not. And if you're blind and you had to have a web page read out to you, then certainly you don't know about colors. So you can still have this element presented in oral form if you cannot see. The fourth one is open standard. The fact that HTML was an open standard was very important. It was a crucial moment. The history would have been different if HTML had been closed. So I come from a computer science background, but I've always also been very interested in, you know, photography, aesthetics. And this is a picture I took from the area where CERN is. The CERN laboratory is underneath the ground we're seeing here. And the picture goes towards Mont Blanc, you know, the tallest mountain in Western Europe. It's a very beautiful area. And it was Kind of striking to see the beauty of the area, and then you get into the CERN laboratory with the buildings from the 1950s. I'm not going to show it to you, but it's pretty ugly, actually. Scientists don't really care so much about the aesthetics. They're more interested in organizing the information they have in logical, abstract levels. But outside of there, our eyes, our human perception, we care a lot about how things look. If I turn the camera around, I could photograph another mountain chain, not the Alps. This is the Jura Mountains. And here you have some cows happily grazing, not knowing anything about the fantastic machine which is underneath them there. Okay, we'll hope that microphone doesn't make too much noise. So what I saw was sort of a disconnect between the two worlds. When designers came in, they wanted, presentation aesthetics, and HTML didn't offer that to them. So what can we do to bridge those two worlds? And what I came up with was CSS, which is a small language, simple language, built around HTML and built to protect HTML. I think if CSS hadn't been invented, somebody would have started just to use images instead of HTML. They said, we can do fonts and colors if we create an image. So you would have just published a web page full of images instead. Then the web would have turned into the world's biggest fax machine. You know about fax machines? You heard of fax machines? No, you haven't. So you have heard of a fax machine. A fax machine basically takes a picture of a document and sends the picture over the telephone wire, and then you print out the picture in the other end. And it's a way of, sharing documents, but it's not a very smart way of sharing documents because you cannot do anything intelligent with the image when you receive it. You cannot search inside that image, or it's very hard to do at least, and it's very error prone. So instead of doing that, we wanted to continue to use HTML, but we wanted to give authors a way of styling information in there as well. We want to be able to say something about font size and colors. So this little snippet of code here just adds a little bit of styling on the H1 element. It's very simple. The CSS specification, at least in the beginning, it was very simple. You don't need to be a programmer to use it. It's not a Turing-complete language. I'm sure many of you are doing programming, and you're very good at it, but most people in this world are not good at being programmers. It's a very selective skill. But I think most people can say something about color still. They can declare that something is a color red or bigger font size. So you can say something about the presentation of the web without being a programmer. So we consciously made CSS a declarative, non-Turing complete language. But unlike HTML, it was visual. Here we do use a visual terminology like colors, like fonts. We also have a version of CSS which says something about volume and voice and pitch and those kind of things to make the audible presentations possible. But for most purposes, it's the visual tools that are being used. CSS is, of course, also an open standard. That's kind of a given now. And I'm very happy about that. People sometimes ask me, why did you let it go? Why did you set it free? Well, if we hadn't opened it up, it probably wouldn't have mattered. People wouldn't have used it, and rightly so. You should only really use open web standards. All right, let's look at some CSS properties here. I'm going to go fast through some of them. The first things we started working on was font size. That's an obvious place to start. You want to be able to reduce and increase the size of the font. And computers, even in 1994, could do that. So being able to set the font size to a certain pixel size was an easy starting point. Then we have a few more units like that. But basically, by writing the code up here, the one-liner up here, you achieve the result here. I'm using a browser to make my presentation, of course. So it's all running with HTML and CSS inside here. Setting font style to italic, you get the slanted text. These are typographic conventions that have been there for hundreds of years. Why is it called italics? probably the history of typography will tell you, probably somebody in Italy started with that style. And we just acquired that term. So CSS borrows a lot of terms from the typographic traditions, including font. Font is a French word about how to type, how to pour metal into a fount. But it's come to use something else in the world of typography, and we decided to continue using it that way. Serif, also French. Background, being able to set the background, this was really hot. I tell you, 1994, this was really hot, when people could set the background to yellow instead of that boring gray. Incredible. And then we had to set a color scheme in a way, and we chose a perhaps slightly cryptic way here. This is based on RGB, and you have to know a little bit about computers actually to understand this, because it's written in the hexadecimal system, You have 0 to 9, and then you have A, B, C, D, E, F. And that's not entirely understandable. We could use just yellow there too as well, but then you have a limited vocabulary. So that's the first thing that needs a little bit of explaining here. This one is fairly easy, being able to set a border around something. Being able to set the border color even, and the border style. We had loads of discussions around what kind of styles should we support. Here's an inset. It's a 3D effect that you can get with a certain color. And people were really excited about these things. Text shadow too. Text shadow was important actually. It was slightly more advanced than the others, but you're able here to set a shadow on a string without having that string appear twice in your document. You just say that this text should have a shadow. And Adobe has sold lots of Photoshop for this feature because people wanted to have it. Before the browser supported this in CSS, you had to make an image. And then we're back to the making image thing, which I really don't like. Doing this is much better. Here you can do it. You can set it on a string. You set it on an element, and if you change that element later, it's automatically updated. If you translate the text from English to Polish or something, it automatically happens. It just works. One line of code just works. And you can add more values to it. Here we've added a different colored shadow, and we make it a little bit fuzzy. The 4 values on top there give that color and fuzziness. I'm not going to explain that in detail, but I'm sure that all of you, within 2 minutes of reading this code and trying to change it, would figure out how it works. You can create some pretty interesting effects here just by changing that one line of code. And then a lot of designers came and said, okay, borders are fine, but I really want them to be rounded in the edges. And I said, I'm not sure about that. Do we really want that, 70s look? You remember the 1970s? You remember the 1970s, yes. There's one guy here, okay, we're 2 of us. I thought, this is so 1970s, so old-fashioned. We don't really want that. We want to look forward, don't we? But instead, it turns out that Apple computers really like rounded, borders on their watches and on their iPads and everything. So the committee that was formed around the CSS specification said, okay, we're gonna do rounded borders. And so we did, and it actually works out quite nicely, actually. I have stopped fighting against it, and I'd rather see the possibilities it has. And this is one of them. Here you can see that by changing that one line of code at the top, from setting 40 pixel radius in all corners, I can add a second value, the slash, and I give it a second value, and I use a different radius for the vertical part of the roundedness. And this is a very slight change in the code, but to our eyes, it's very different, right? Our eyes are so attuned to this kind of perception that we see the difference very clearly. And this is what designers use. They have a toolbox now that they can use, and they can set a style. They can style a whole website by doing that one change in one style sheet. So it's a very powerful tool, even if it's not a programming language and it's easy to read, I would say. You can still do very powerful things with it. And then you can change, again, a variation. You just set different values, and you get a pointiness. And it's all quite silly. It's all our human perception the search engines don't care about it. Google doesn't index this document in any different way, whether it has a pointy border or not. But to our human perception, it is very important. And then in CSS3, I'm sort of walking through the generations here. In CSS3, we've added linear gradient, so you can have these effects to go from one color to the other, and you can specify where it should happen and how steep the curve should be and all that. This is all based on what designers would like to have. And my examples aren't beautiful, actually. They're more there to show what is technically possible. But in the hands of the right designers, this actually works quite well. And I'm happy to see that modern websites do use these features probably not very readable, but it's there if you need it. Now, writing a specification is one thing. Having browsers do it right is another thing. And a lot of the battle to make CSS part of the web has been to lobby to have browser vendors implement the standard correctly. And sometimes correctly was actually, there was actually a problem in the specification, so we needed to change the specification based on feedback from implementers. So it goes both ways here, actually, and we've had, therefore, different browser makers have been part of this process. Otherwise, it wouldn't have worked. But in the beginning, it was a little bit hard. I remember from CSS1 was launched, trying to convince Netscape and Microsoft. Those were the two browsers at the time that were very popular. And they both said they would do CSS. And they did implement something that looked like CSS, and the most basic stuff worked. But both of them had an interest in sort of taking the web in their own direction. They saw that this was a very valuable thing, and if they could own it, it would be better for them at least. So they sort of were not coming together. They were going apart. And then this little Norwegian browser company called Opera came along, and they implemented CSS, and they did it right. And I was amazed. Here comes, wow, somebody who implemented it and did it correctly. And I happened to know the guys from before. I hadn't really believed in them when they said they would start making a browser, but I saw that they could do it. So I joined Opera after a few years working for the World Wide Web Consortium, and I was the CTO of Opera for 18 years. I no longer have that role, but I'm very proud to say that many of the best colleagues in Opera and that are still with Opera are here in Poland, in Wrocław. Did I say that right? Yes? Thank you, thank you. I've been there many times, always practicing. So I'm going to say a little bit more about Opera, but that's later. But talking about how to get specifications implemented correctly, that's a very important part of the standards work. And we fortunately had a lot of support from the designers communities, because they were spending hours trying to get pages to look right, and sometimes they had to write one version for Microsoft and one for Netscape, and that was more work for them. Of course, if you charge by the hour, maybe that's a good thing. But then again, it's not so interesting work. So we decided, and I had to say I was really part of the grassroots movement to try to fix this, even if I worked for Opera. But we put out this challenge to Microsoft, because Microsoft was the big problem. Microsoft was the big problem because they had 90% of the browser market at the time. This was in the early 2000s. And also, they had the worst implementation. So when we put out the ACID 2 test, it's a very difficult test. But if you get it right, it looks like a face. And everyone recognizes that. You can see this face on a split of a second. You see that this is right. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, if you open that page, it looks simple. It's not simple. Every pixel in this web page has a test behind it. So if you don't pass that test, you will not get this right. It would look different. And all the browsers had problems, but the worst problem was with IE6. And this is, what the page looked like in IE6. I'm glad you laughed. Kind of a bloody face. Is that better?
I think it's rubbing up against
Okay, now I have a little balancing act here. Okay, let's try there. Yeah? Okay, so look, so we have a, remember the face, right? So we can still see it has eyes, yeah, 2 eyes. There's no nose, there is a mouth, but there's something coming out of the mouth, something is dribbling. So obviously here's a problem. And then we lobbied Microsoft, we sent them emails and saying, you know, here's the acid test, please, why don't you support it? And then when IE7 came out, about a year later, we all ran to test the ACID 2 page. You know, have they fixed all the bugs that we reported? And this is what it looked like in IE7. So let's analyze this. We can still see the 2 eyes, right? And maybe the red thing there is a nose, actually. I don't know. It has a scroll bar on it. My nose doesn't have a scroll bar on it. There is a mouth there as well, but the dribbling is perhaps even worse. So this was bad news. You know, they've had a year to fix the problems, but they actually added more than they fixed, it seemed. So we thought, you know, is this the end? Are we going to give up? Is CSS dead? We're never going to be able to do this. You had to learn to write the Microsoft dialect instead. But then something incredible happened. A lot of people stood up and said, you know, we want Microsoft to do the standards. When Microsoft gave talks at conferences, there was always one person in the back asking, you know, when are you going to do ACID 2? And I think, you know, at some point somebody inside must have said, okay, we're just going to have to deal with it. Just fix the problems. Because when IE8 came out, this is what it looked like. They had decided, we're going to fix the problems. And I think this shows that the power of the community here is so that if even big companies get a lot of pressure from activists, many of them students like yourself, they need to change their behavior. So I'm happy to report that after this, after Microsoft supported ACID 2, and all the other browsers too, changed their implementations, it's actually been quite usable. And today you won't find any web page pretty much that doesn't use CSS. Another thing we did with Microsoft was to go to the EU Commission in Brussels and say it's really unfair that Microsoft, and now I'm talking as an Opera employee, I'm not talking as a standards guy here. I'm talking about the competition landscape with browsers, especially in Europe. And we said it's really unfair that Microsoft ships all these operating systems and then they just put in their own browsers so that you're kind of forced to use, not really forced maybe, but few people will download a browser actively. That's why Microsoft has 90% market share. And the Commission was actually quite helpful. I happen to be against the EU myself. I voted no in the Norwegian referendum in 1994. And Norway is still not a member, but we're a member of the European Economic Area. So that's why the Commission could take on our case. And they managed to get Microsoft to offer a browser choice, which was a very good thing. If you opened a new Windows machine in Europe, you would get this screen asking you, which browser do you want to use? And if you clicked on one of the other ones, like Opera or Safari, Google, Firefox, then you would download this from the Opera or the other vendor's website. So there was still a bit of a hurdle in the sense you had to click and download and install, but it was much better. And this helped the landscape to change so that Microsoft didn't anymore have 90% of the user base. And I'm mentioning this now. This was back in 2010. I'm mentioning that today because just 2 days ago, Google announced that they will provide browser choice screen on Android. There have been, yeah, you cheering? Are we cheering? Do we want that? Yeah. That's good. That's good. This is very important, I think. And I know the Commission has been involved with Google as well. They have fined them. They have talked about the competition. I'm not sure exactly what went on behind the closed meeting rooms here. But it's very good that Google comes out and says, we will offer a browser choice screen. At least in Europe, maybe all over. I don't know. We had to look deeper into this. But I think it's good news. And I think it's great that they were able to reuse an old idea from 2010. And hopefully that can make it a more competitive landscape. Because we do want, I mean, it's not Microsoft today, right? It's Google today, and maybe Apple. You know, these are big and powerful companies, and they have a lot of data. They know a lot about us. We need to be very conscious about what kind of data we give them and what kind of software we use and what kind of settings are there in the background. And I think a good way of being conscious is to actually use browsers from different companies. Opera would be an obvious choice for me since I've been so closely associated with it, but there are many others to choose from as well. Okay, let's continue with the CSS. Like I said, you could choose the font family, serif, you could set the font size, but there wasn't a lot of fonts available at the time. Microsoft, I've said a lot of bad things about Microsoft. I should also say something very good about Microsoft, because they actually donated these fonts. I'm sure you recognize the names of many of them. These were, you know, premier fonts in the 1990s, and Microsoft donated them to the web community, said, anyone can use this, and you can install them on Apple computers and Linux computers and use them on your mobile phones and everywhere. So we had 10 good fonts that were used extensively. But at some point, even with 10 fonts, it's not enough variety. So you want to be able to download fonts. And that's one thing that we did put into the CSS specification. We did find a way to point to a font resources on the web somewhere, and the browser would see this link, download the font, install it temporarily, and use it to show the documents. By now, this is something that all of the web uses. It was quite a tough fight at the time, because many font designers were afraid that, you know, people would steal their fonts and such. This is, the Angel font is done by a font designer called Dieter Steffmann, German. He made a lot of fonts available, and they were all public domain. So there's been a lot of creativity that's been harnessed because we added this feature. And actually, the people who sell fonts too, they've had a lot of business because people are making they're ordering their own fonts, bespoke fonts, they're called. So there's a lot of business in there. Any font designers here? Font design is actually very interesting. You should look into that if you want to do something, you know, as a hobby project or something. Here's more of Dieter Steffmann's fonts. Becker inline, broadcast titling. You know, I'm not sure I can recommend the Cardiff font if you're going to write your CV, right? Or your next novel. You don't want to use it, but you know, in a birthday invitation or something, you want to have a special effect. These fonts are available to use. Another thing you can do with fonts is actually support more scripts. Because the computers we buy in the West, they have maybe, you know, a rich set of fonts now, but they only cover or they mostly cover the Western world. And in India, where they have many index scripts, they are not able to show their local languages in the fonts that come with their computers. So in 2011, I think this was, Wikipedia actually started using web fonts to support all these scripts that didn't have good font support. I don't know much about index scripts, but I know that the web pages of Wikipedia now can be displayed in all these local languages. And if there's one project that's been good for the world, I think it's Wikipedia. The fact that we now have, you know, Wikipedia in our pockets is a fantastic thing, and I think it's something that all the languages, all the scripts, all the countries of the world should be able to do. Oops. Here's my... That was my little effect that I was going to use. I'm jumping to something else now. This is another thing that came in CSS3, animations. And what you're seeing here, the figure is actually the state symbol of Norway. We don't have many lions roaming around our forests, but we still have the lion as a state symbol for some reason. And what you saw there was actually an animation running. When I hover over the symbol, it does a jump. And this is actually, I'm actually breaking Norwegian law here. There's no police around, is there? The law says that the state symbol should be in the middle of the document, which it is. It should be on top of the document. That's also the case. But it should be standing upright. They shouldn't be swinging around. So CSS code can be illegal. But let's look at the code. OK, so there's an image element. This is HTML. And we just point to a little SVG image here. SVG, scalable vector graphics. So the image here is done in SVG, but the animation is done in CSS. And what we say here is that the image element should have a transition phase of 1 second. Okay, what that means, we had to actually read the next line to understand. The image should, when we hover over it with the pointer, there should be a transformation so that the image should rotate by minus 360 degrees. Okay? I think you can get that, right? You hover over it and you get a rotation effect. And I'm quite sure that if I asked you to change the rotation direction of this very brave lion of ours, you would pretty much know how to do this in 10 seconds, wouldn't you? Yeah? 1 second. 1 second. Yeah, exactly. Good. That's good. You would just remove the minus, of course. Yes. So it's quite easy to do. It's quite easy to take somebody's code and change it, and that's been the purpose of CSS, you know. It's easy to make web pages. Okay, a little bit about Opera again. Opera was a browser, and we were competing with Microsoft and Netscape and Mozilla and Safari and Chrome on the desktop. But we were also very early, you know, before Safari and before Chrome, we were actually running on mobile phones and TV sets and games consoles. So we were able to take our code to places that no other browser was running. The web was mostly a PC thing until things changed. But one of the things we did was Opera Mini. We set up servers to compress web pages that people wanted to use on their mobile phones. And typically we could get around an 80% data saving. We compressed the images down, we compressed the text, etc. And by having that data save feature, we were able to save, there's the statistics from Russia in 2016, I believe. They have a lot of people using Opera Mini there, and we saved 26,000 terabytes of mobile data. And that's a lot of data, and it translates to a lot of money for users, because we often pay by the megabyte, or if we don't, we still have a quota that we had to refer to. So if you can save data, that's a good thing. When we first launched this was quite novel. When we first launched this, let's see, when is this article from? This is from 2009, okay? We had some interesting newspaper articles come up in Chicago. Okay, so these journalists in Chicago had discovered that most of the users of their real-time bus information system were from Norway. Okay, so at the time, it was quite novel also to have, you know, real-time bus information, right? Now we have it. Can you do that in Krakow now? Can you see where the buses are? Yeah, like you can see where the Uber taxis are and such. You know, this is now available online. This was different I sound old, do I? Yeah. Things were different in the old days, yeah? It's not more than 10 years ago. Things changed faster. Okay, but Chicago had it very early. And they wrote articles, because these journalists had been given access to the logs, and they saw that most of the users were Norwegians. So one article says, Norwegians are either utterly fascinated with the comings and goings of CTA buses, or there just aren't enough recreational activities in the land of fjords and Viking ships. And of course, you're very smart. You know what happened. It wasn't actually people from Norway following the buses of Chicago. What happened there was that, you know, people in Chicago were, you know, standing waiting for the bus and freezing, and they happened to have Opera Mini in their pockets, so they wanted to check when's the bus coming. But because Opera Mini was running everything through a server farm, which was in the basement of our office in Oslo, it seemed as if, you know, we were all Norwegians. So this is one way of seeing, you know, the world is changing. When you have access to the internet, geography is kind of changing, and you can't really tell so much what happens. So we had, Opera Mini was very successful for many years. Before we had real phones, we were able to run the web on a lot of Nokia phones, a lot of Java phones, and we gave people access to web pages wherever they were. And this statistics from 2010 is quite telling of where this happened. It's not really statistic. It is real statistics, but it's not been balanced for population, etc. So just by counting users, we can see that the top country here is Russia. We had a lot of users in Russia. You might have expected that there would be other, users in, United States would be the most, but that wasn't the case. So Russia was number one. What's number two? You know what that is? Indonesia, very good. 3. India, excellent. Ukraine, good. China? No? No? South Africa, right. Nigeria, correct. Vietnam? United States, heard of them, yes. Brazil, good, you're good. Let's go on. What's this one? Belarus, United Kingdom, Turkey, Kazakhstan, Philippines. You know about Poland? Very good. Kenya, Egypt, Bangladesh, dear Germany. There we are. You're almost as good as the third class in Kiev, which I asked, a while back. But it shows kind of, Bangladesh beats Germany here. Of course, as I said, it's not balanced. There's more people in Bangladesh than in Germany. But it shows that the web is not just a Western thing or a rich world thing. This is a thing that's happening all over. And people want access to the web wherever they are and whatever phone they have in their pockets. We also saw this in 2011 when the Egyptian revolution came on. We saw that, we had Opera Mini users before the revolution, and then suddenly it picks up. Probably because people are, maybe not trusting government sources anymore, not trusting what they see on TV. They want access to independent news, so they use the web to find that, and they pick up Opera from their pockets. And we see a very big spike in usage. And then the government sees that something's happening, they turn off the internet. Maybe they realize, people are getting information from the outside, it's not a good thing. They just turn it off. So for 3 days, it's dark. And then it comes back again. And we don't really know why this happened. Maybe because, people get angrier if they don't get access to the web. We don't know. But when it comes back on again, we see that usage stabilizes at a much higher level than before. So that when people, what we learned from this is that when people get used to getting their information on their mobile phones from independent sources, they will continue to do so. And I think, many of you are using your screens here in this room as well. It's the first thing we pick up when a crisis situation happens. You want to check your family, it's sort of the number one source of information is your mobile phone and the website. You check the news, etc. So as such, it has changed the world quite a bit. Okay, now I'm going to go back to technical stuff. The VV unit. You heard of that? Yes. This actually is, it's not a unit that's been sponsored by Volkswagen. It is a unit that sets the page, that sets the size as to the width of the screen. That's what it says for. That's what it stands for, viewport width. And now let's see if I can find a page that uses this. I should have had this open. Let's see. Okay, so this is one of my own pages. So what I'm doing here, it's not important what the page says, but what you see is that the font size there changes as per the width of the screen. So that means you don't have to have JavaScript checking the width and resizing the thing. It just happens automatically. And this is something that hasn't been in CSS before. This is something people have asked for. So it's something that we have recently added, and it's a good thing. I joked about Volkswagen. They, of course, didn't sponsor. We wouldn't allow such sponsorship. But there is a very cute page showing sort of what you can do with CSS and animation, and it uses this iconic Volkswagen car. And this is all done in HTML and CSS. There's no scripting involved here. So you can do these animations. You can do, art with, CSS. You can without using, an image program, you can actually do a lot of cute stuff. This is kind of taking the specification to its limit. This is not what CSS was intended to do. But of course, when you create something, you don't really know what people will use it for. How much time do I have?
If we want to have questions, I believe there will be questions, not so much.
Yeah, should we start having questions soon?
Well, I encourage you to ask any questions if you have them, because gifts are provided for asking them, so.
Are there any questions? Somebody wanted to ask something now? Yeah, go ahead.
So you said that CSS was there almost from the start of HTML, but then on the other hand you also got tags like B for bold and...
Yeah, that's true. No, it's a good point. I said, HTML was very semantic, and that's almost true. But there were some tags, bold and italic, were in there from the beginning. Because they are conventions. Some would say, the purists would say they shouldn't have been there, it was a mistake. We should use the emphasis tag instead, and then we should use CSS to say that something is italic or bold. But they were put in there at an early, I'm not sure whether Tim thought about that a lot, or whether he just, they're so common to use and they're so innocent, so let's just have them in there. But it created a problem when people continued that, when they added the blink tag, for example, that's when things get really bad. But there was a lot of people said, we shouldn't do CSS, we should extend HTML instead. So people were thinking in that direction. Yeah? Anything else? Yes?
I wanted to ask about the Opera compression service.
Yeah.
First, isn't it costly to provide it for so many users?
Yeah.
Secondly, were you approached by Norwegian or other government about such comprehensive service?
Yes, it's two very good questions. Yes, it is expensive to run a service like that. You need to have a lot of computers in your basement, or you need to rent computers from somewhere. We have the same, Opera has the same issue. Opera also provides VPN, virtual private network, where you can select from your browser, you can select where you want to be seen as being. If you, for example, want to check what flight, airline costs are in other parts of the world, you can make a setting in Opera. And that also requires a lot of computers and connections. And this is only possible because you can also make money from the browser. When Opera started making browsers, they charged $39 per copy. And that turned out not to be so successful because people had free browsers from Microsoft and Netscape. So Opera had to change. But fortunately, we also found that there was a business model in there. And the business model is basically to team up with search engines, to talk to Google and say, what will you pay us per search that we send your way from the Opera browser? And I can't tell you how much it is. I don't remember anymore, and it's probably a secret by now. But both Firefox and Mozilla and others have had significant revenue from that. So the more users you can get, the more you make from searches, basically getting a small cut from the search income. So there had to be that balancing between how much does a server cost versus how many users we can get in addition. And the second about the government, yes, government interference is an issue. We've had governments knocking on our doors in various parts of the world. Luckily, I was not the one dealing with that. I wasn't the one opening doors. I do think there needs to be a balance here. There are cases when you really want to help the government because people are really trying to do bad things on the internet as well. But then we must make sure that we don't provide a government censorship or any censorship by anyone else. I think freedom of speech is one of the very fundamental rights that we have, and one that has been strengthened in general by the web. But we see people who want to turn off that as well. We see that Facebook you know, all the companies out there are also filtering, and we need to be conscious that we have a right to say something, but we don't really have the right to be crooks, you know? Can we find a balance there? It's difficult. I don't know. We'll try. Yeah? ECMAScript. Yes. ECMAScript and JavaScript, as it's mostly called, right? Well, in October 1994, CSS was proposed, and 3 days later, I think it was 3 days later, Netscape launched ECMAScript, or JavaScript. It was called JavaScript then, and then it became, the standard became ECMAScript. So they were launched roughly at the same time, and they were taking slightly different direction because JavaScript is a real programming language. It's a Turing-complete language. And a lot of people are saying, you know, when we have JavaScript, we don't really need CSS because you can change the color with the JavaScript statement instead of using a style sheet. I would say you shouldn't try doing that really because you want there to be properties defined in CSS. JavaScript by itself doesn't define any properties, so that work has to be done anyway. And once you have those properties, you should use the style sheet syntax because it's much more efficient than having to learn how to program. So I would say if you have a choice, you know, do your styling in CSS. If you really need to do something else more active, and there are many reasons why you need that, then you should use JavaScript. And many of the things that I showed you today, like the hovering thing, the hover concept, where you put a pointer over something and it spins, that hover thing was not in CSS from the beginning. It came in CSS 3 because we saw that a lot of people wanted to do that kind of things. So we're learning, we're picking up from the JavaScript crowd, seeing what are the effects that they're looking for, and then putting it into the CSS specifications. So I think it's possible to live, you know, peacefully together, which is what we should try. Yeah. Yeah, in the back?
Let's talk about the future of CSS.
Yeah.
We have projects like the 2D project and
Yes.
it has selector.
Yes.
What's your stance on that? Do you support such JS in CSS?
I don't support JS in CSS. I think that's mixing two things that shouldn't be mixed. I think those should be apart. But I do think we should extend CSS carefully. We should add some things. And I have some more slides on that, actually. I know I'm running out of time here. But I wanted to show you, for example, where you could use the grid system to design pages. These are pictures from my apple farm in Norway, where I've used the system of grid to, you know, put together a sort of a two-dimensional page with these images. The problem you will be having when you use some of these new things is that you have to try the scaling. Does it scale to a mobile phone screen where you have just a small screen? Not always. Here's another example using multi-columns. This is another thing that's available now where you can actually change the number of columns as the thing makes, you know, changes the width. You see here we're starting out with, let's see, 5 columns, and we make it, you know, more narrow. It goes down to 4 and 3 and 2 and 1 column. So there are some things that are being added to the CSS specification that will help you do more designs. There is also a risk, though, of adding too many things together. If I can just go to that page. The layout models. I now count about 6. There's actually one more. There's actually 7 layout models that can all do the same thing, doing this basic design here. So the specifications are growing, and we need to be a little careful. We need to make sure this, you know, stays simple. There was another question up there?
If you have any questions, there is a room near the elevators. There is not a room per se, but some space near the elevator when you can ask Håkon some questions. If you have time, that
okay,
is.
that's good. Can I end by giving you a challenge? Okay? I think you should all write a book, and you should format it in CSS and write the text in HTML. You will learn a lot about typography, you will learn a lot about web standards, and it's quite easy to do. And I can say that because I've done it. I've written a book about CSS, which was written in CSS itself. And others have done the same thing. And we should make sure that we can use these things for something that lasts. And having a book in your hand is a wonderful feeling. Touch the paper, it's a good thing. It's probably going to last longer than the web pages you write. And it's a good Christmas gift as well to your mother. So you are hereby challenged. Thank you so much.